Hi, everybody. I wish we were all in Sevilla together instead of at home, but hopefully the talk is okay. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about our paper, an empirical exploration of deep recurrent connections using Neuro-Evolution. My co-authors on this are Abdelrahman Elsaid. He's one of my PhD students, and also Alexander Ororbia, who's another professor here at RIT. And then we have some collaborators in private industry from Microbeam Technologies and some others at the University of North Dakota. They've helped with some domain knowledge in providing the data sets that we've used. Well, maybe I should hit play. There we go. Okay, so just a brief overview of my talk. First, I'll talk a little bit about neuroevolution for recurrent neural networks and why it's a bit different than doing neuroevolution for your feed-forward or convolutional neural networks, which you probably more commonly see. I'll talk about our exam algorithm in brief, just because we probably don't have too much time for me to go into a lot of detail on it. Talk about how we've used that to evolve recurrent neural networks for time series data prediction, and talk about some of the results of the study. So a little background about using neuroevolution for recurrent neural networks. Just general background on recurrent neural networks themselves. They're a little bit different than your standard neural networks in that they allow connections which can go either backward in the network, or what's actually happening is that they're spanning different periods of time. So you usually use a recurrent neural network for time series data or sequential data, where you're trying to capture kind of long-term dependencies in that sequence. So what happens is when you have these backwards or even looping connections inside your network, you end up having to unroll your network over time, which makes this really, really long and deep network. So even with a really simple, network here, where we have one input, one output, and two hidden nodes, and just one recurrent connection, if we unroll it over 4 time steps, all of a sudden we have this very deep network. So when you train this, and do backpropagation through time, the errors from the final output backpropagate throughout the entire network. So when people talk about having issues training deep neural networks of the convolutional type, and they have 30 or 40 or 50 layers, well, in a recurrent neural network, you could have thousands of them, depending on how many time steps your network has. So the exploding and vanishing gradient problems become a lot harder. In terms of a couple other things, we also have a much larger search space. So in most architectures you see, traditionally, your recurrent connections, they're only going to span 1 time step. So basically, they're feeding network from the previous pass through the neural network into the next one. Well, that doesn't have to be the case. So you can actually have networks which span multiple time steps. So maybe I'm going to feed this data forward 3, 4, or 5 time steps in the future. And also they can connect, go forward in the network. So you could actually have 2 forward connections between hidden node and hidden node 2, one doing just a feed forward pass, but the other passing data further into the future. So since we can do this out to however many time steps we have in our sequence, we have a much larger search space to deal with. So just to give you an idea of some of the things you can work with, here up top we have a recurrent neural network. Again, it's simple. It only has 1 input, 1 output, and 2 hidden nodes, but we have a bunch of different recurrent connections that are possible to be there. So we have recurrent connections here, like this one in purple, which just for 1 time step, and they go right to the next, and they go from the same node back to itself. We have ones that go from 1 time step going backwards in the network. Then we have those other ones that go forward in the network. So in this case, spanning 2 time steps or 3 time steps. So we have a bunch of different combinations of directions that these recurrent edges can go in, and how far they go backward and forward in time. So basically the takeaway here is if you want a really fun neuroevolution problem to play around with, play with recurrent neural networks, because you have a much larger search space. Okay, so for this work, we kind of coined these connections which span 1 or more time step as deep recurrent connections. So in traditional literature, for a while they were pretty I guess kind of a hot topic, where there were a number of sorry, I have a cat here. There were a number of papers that invaded them, calling them either time skips or time windows, sometimes embedded memory order, something like that. And they were shown to significantly increase recurrent neural network computational abilities. But over the last maybe decade or so, they kind of fell out of favor, because short-term memory networks and other memory cells became really hot topics, and I guess people forgot about these. That being said, there is at least one recent work from Schmid-Humer's lab that does still try to incorporate some of these time skip connections. So what we're looking into in this work as well, I personally, I think one of the reasons people ignore them a lot nowadays is that, well, there's too many options. So it's easier to just stick with your memory cells and that be that. But with Neuro-Evolution, we can explore the search space and see what we can come up with. So generally speaking, nowadays there's a lot of various memory cell architectures that people out there and are studying. So LSTMs are probably the archetype, the common one that everybody knows about. But more recently, you have gated recurrent units, minimal gated units, update gate recurrent neural networks, and delta RNNs. And basically, the idea behind all of these is, well, can we have less trainable parameters in our memory cell but get similar performance? And so a lot of like kind of standard best practices are what people think is, well, these are good enough to capture these long-term dependencies, so we don't need to use time skip or deep recurrent connections. But hopefully at the end of this talk, we'll maybe see that that's maybe not the case. So the other big thrust of this work, and this is something probably I've talked about a bit in the past if you've seen any of my other talks, is I think there's another opportunity when it comes to neuroevolution beyond just saying, oh, well, we beat these other benchmarks in this particular task. Nowadays, a lot of times when people test a new component or structure in a neural network, they basically take a couple fixed architectures and swap things in and out and say, well, on these fixed architectures, it works better, so maybe this is something we want to use now. But we have more power than that when we use neuroevolution, because basically we can say, well, we evolved, 1,000 or 100,000 architectures with neural networks with these particular components, and then a bunch more with these other particular components. And now we're comparing, what are the best case scenarios in terms of what architectures work well for those components, as opposed to maybe a couple cherry-picked fixed architectures. So I think this provides a more rigorous comparison if we want to learn more about different things that we could use in a neural network. So hopefully I can motivate that a little bit through this talk too. So I'll talk a little bit about the Neuro-Evolution algorithm we use for this work. I mean, you could have done it with something else, and if somebody wants to recreate it and get similar results, that would be very cool. But the algorithm we used is EXAMM. It's based on NEAT, so the Neuro-Evolution of Augmenting Topologies, which is very popular. It works fairly similar. It progressively grows larger and larger recurrent neural networks. And in the case, and we had some previous work at last year's EvoStar on EXALT, which was kind of the former version of this. So in EXALT, we could only have simple neurons or LSTMs. In EXAMM, we can have any of the 6 kind of most common recurrent neural network memory cells now. EXAMM is parallel. We use islands of populations to kind of increase parallelism and convergence rates. We have a bunch of kind of mutation refinement. So we have a bunch of edge level operations, such as adding edges and recurrent edges. When we add a recurrent edge in EXAMM, we can have it between a specified range of time skips. So in this case, we did between 1 and 10, but we could go higher. And actually, that's something we want to look at in the future. We can split edges, disable edges, and enable edges. One of the things that EXAMM adds over NEAT, which does those edge level mutations, is we can do node level mutations. So we can add nodes, split nodes, merge nodes, disable and enable nodes. Another kind of cool thing that works really well for EXAMM is we use Lamarckian or epigenetic weight initialization. So when we generate a new neural network to train, we inherit all the weights from the parents using a bit of a crossover. So if we have 2 parents, we kind of combine their weights together. And then if we add any new components, we initialize them based on the distribution of weights in the parents. So we're kind of like doing mini transfer learning every time we generate a new genome to train. And we found that this lets us, instead of having to train our neural networks for 100 or 1,000 epochs, we can maybe do 5 or 10 and still get really good results. So it allows us to examine a lot more neural network architectures while we're running this. So if you want to learn more about EXAMM, you can read up on some of these other papers, just because we're limited on time there. Okay. So in this work, we're using recurrent neural networks for time series data prediction. Again, this is a little bit different than some of the common things people use neural networks for, which is classification, right? Everybody nowadays is using CNNs for image processing. Well, those are usually classification tasks. Here, since we're doing time series data prediction, it's a regression task, and these tend to be a little bit harder to do, because instead of trying to just get some of your outputs of your neural networks higher than others to make it predict the right thing via softmax or an SVM. Output layer here, we're trying to predict exact value. So what is this particular parameter going to be X amount of time in the future, which makes it a little bit more challenging. So we use two real world data sets, which we freely provide, as open on our GitHub repository. One was 10 flights from a flight database. Each flight is 1 to 3 hours long. It has 26 input parameters, and there's a reading every second. So these could be 5,000 to 6,000 time steps long. So when we unroll our neural networks, things get really big. The other data set was from a coal-fired power plant. And each one of these input files was 10 days long with per minute recordings, and we had 10 parameters there. We predicted 2 different parameters from the coal plant. So we evolved neural networks to predict fuel flow, and another set to do flame intensity. And just to get an idea of what these look like, they're really noisy, and they have these sudden drops when the plant has to shut down for one issue or another. And that's one of the things we want to predict is, can we see these things coming before they happen? And likewise, the oil flow is a little bit noisy, but it has these peaks. So you can see if you wanted to use like a statistical method like ARIMA on these, it would just completely miss these things because it's kind of a variation of a running average. For the flight data, we were trying to predict engine RPM and pitch. And similarly, these are, again, noisy, non-seasonal, not something that you can really use a statistical method for. And we have all these different input parameters that are correlated, which give us better predictions. So neural networks are great for these prediction tasks. Okay, so what did we do? We ran EXAMM a bunch of different ways. We tried it with each type of memory cell alone. We tried it with each type of memory cell and simple neurons at the same time, so it could pick between the two. We tried it with every possible memory cell and that we could have, so selecting from all 6 at once. And then we did this without deep recurrent connections and with deep recurrent connections. So we wanted to see, okay, for all these different kind of architectural components, do we get any benefit from adding these deep recurrent connections, which people don't seem to be looking into too much anymore? We did this using k-fold cross-validation. So we left two training files out as test data and did k-fold cross-validation that way. In total, we ran, I think, almost 50, we ran over 5,200 different experiments. And each one of those, we trained 2,000 recurrent neural networks for 10 epochs each. We use the high performance computing systems here at RIT. So in total, we trained about 5.6 million recurrent neural networks for this work, and it took about 26,000 CPU hours in total. But luckily, we had about 1,000 cores, so it wasn't that, it didn't take too long. One of the things we did here, so for each fold and strategy, we calculated kind of the average performance, which was the best case after each one of the repeats on a particular fold, and as well as the best. And we measured how far they were from the mean over all the best final results. And the idea here is different testing files had kind of different difficulty, right? So if we just use the average of the actual accuracy, it would be off and it would be biased to some of those folds that were harder than the others. So using standard deviation allowed us to kind of put the results together a little bit better. So what did we find? So for flame intensity and oil flow, all the results here in bold were the ones that added deep recurrent connections. And we can see there's a pretty big trend here. For flame intensity, every experiment we did that added the deep recurrent connections beat out the ones that didn't, and some by quite a bit. And this is in the average case over the 10 runs. Similarly, for oil flow, we see most of the things down here all include these deep recurrent connections. Similarly, for pitch and RPM, we're seeing something similar. For RPM, again, every single experiment we did that added the deep recurrent connections beat out any of the ones that didn't have them. We have one outlier here for the networks that only had MGU nodes, no simple nodes, no deep recurrent connections, doing really well on pitch in the average case. I guess that's your no free lunch theorem, but you can see there's a pretty huge trend here that when we added in these deep recurrent connections that for the most part, people haven't been using much anymore. We're seeing huge benefits, even when using the memory cells that everybody seems to like very much now. When we look at the best case, again, So this is instead of the average of all 10 repeats, it's the best found neural network of the 10 repeats, how better that was than the mean. We're seeing, again, down at the bottom here, pretty much everything has recurrent connections in there. And in a lot of cases, also simple neurons as well. One of the really interesting things we found here is in the case of pitch, our best found neural network didn't even have any memory cells. So just simple neurons, your vanilla feed forward neurons and deep recurrent connections beat out any of the memory cells, which is kind of surprising for us. So that was a pretty cool result. So if we look at the top 3 and bottom 3 counts, the new delta RNN nodes are performing very impressively. So they're really if we look at the top 3, they were in pretty much everything. So they're probably a memory cell that people might want to look into nowadays. LSTMs, which have been around for a while, they did pretty well in the average case, not so well in the best case, and they were in the bottom a lot, actually. And then the interesting thing here is when simple neurons were in there with deep recurrent connections, they actually did pretty well. They were in the best as much as, say, an LSTM or an MGU. And actually, these bottom cases were when they didn't have deep recurrent connections. So we saw kind of a big benefit from there. So if we look at deviation, so how did things improve when we added in simple neurons? We didn't see too big of an improvement, except a little case in the MGUs. But when we added in those deep recurrent connections, pretty much everything except for MGU had a pretty big shift in terms of improved performance. So just kind of recap, adding in those deep time skip connections or those deep recurrent connections provided a really big benefit across the different data sets. The one really interesting thing we found is that having no memory cells but deep recurrent connections also did really well. So maybe there's something we need to look into here when we're designing recurrent neural networks. And also the new delta recurrent neural network cells did very well as well. So some kind of major takeaways here. Neuro-evolution for recurrent neural networks is really fun. You have a much larger search space than just your standard feed forward or convolutional neural networks. So if you're looking for a fun neuro-evolution challenge, I suggest looking into it. Another one, you can use neuro-evolution to benchmark neural network components, right? We don't need to just use neuro-evolution to try and beat out best networks on certain data sets. We can use them to kind of examine and learn more about machine learning and maybe kind of inform the machine learning community through that. And then we used in our study, we found a limitation in current thought and best practices when it comes to RNNs. So at least for our time series data prediction, memory cells aren't the be all end all. Adding in these deep recurrent connections adds quite a bit of benefit. So we're obviously missing something when it comes to these memory cells. And in some cases, we were able to beat out memory cells just using deep recurrent connections, which is pretty cool. So we have a bunch of future work here. We'd like to kind of evolve memory cell structures. Here we were like evolving a superstructure of memory cells, but can we figure out what what's a good internal shape for a memory cell? Looking into more different activation functions, we mostly use TANH for our memory cells here. Doing some hyperparameter optimization. So while we're evolving the structure and the weights of our neural networks, can we also be evolving the hyperparameters we're training them for? Doing some even more higher level mutations like layer levels, so adding in layers at a time instead of individual nodes. And then self-tuning. So we use kind of fixed probabilities for the different mutations we did in EXAMM. So can we improve on that a little bit? So we kind of would like to use these findings to examine and improve existing RNN memory cell structures. We've noticed maybe we're missing something here. Maybe we need to add deep recurrent connections within memory cells or something like that to improve things. So I think there's a lot of future work here. So any questions? And we acknowledge the Department of Energy and the FAA for supporting this research.
Thank you so much, Travis. Any question? Please make any question using the chat or using your microphone. No questions? Okay, thank you, Travis.